Ilya, it's great seeing you today.
Thanks for having me.
So, Ilya, tell me what's going on. You yourself are a Russian, born in Russia, served in the Russian parliament, but actually left Russia in 2014 after the full-scale invasion and moved to Ukraine. And you're a very active Ukraine supporter, as everybody well knows. So I want to get your thought on a couple of things. One is that we talk a lot about the war in Ukraine, but ultimately, I would argue the war in Ukraine is simply a symptom of an illness, a disease, and that disease is called Vladimir Putin. But we see that disease's symptoms around the world. We see it in the Georgian elections that the pro-Russian candidate won. We see it in the case of Moldova, where they tried to steal the elections. We see the Assad regime. We see the alliance with North Korea. Around the world, we see the symptoms of somebody named Putin. And as long as he remains, I don't think that Russia is going to get better. It's going to be the exact same dictatorship it's been for 24 years. What do you see?
Jason, you actually nailed it. The problem is not Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is just a name, just a label, just a brand, just a face. The actual problem is imperialistic dictatorship. That's the problem. And indeed, we need to eradicate dictatorship, and we need to make sure that Russia is no longer an empire. And that would automatically remove Putin from office, and that would prevent another Putin to be installed there. Because if Russia remains an empire, the next one could be even worse. And that's exactly the reason why I, being a Russian parliamentarian, defend the interests of my constituency fighting in Ukraine against Russians. Because I'm fighting not against my people, I am fighting against Putinists. I am fighting against this army, like a lot of German anti-fascists were doing during World War II when they were fighting against Hitler's army.
So when you look at that, though, what is the reaction from Russians? How do they interpret what you're doing? You've said very provocative things. In fact, you wrote a book called Does Putin Need to Die? So how do Russians interpret that?
Fortunately or unfortunately, Russians did not read the book, because it's totally prohibited on the territory of Russia. And Russia declared me a terrorist, an extremist, an undesirable person, a foreign agent. I already lost count for criminal cases they have opened against me, but I am now the big boogeyman there, so they are not publishing my books. And maybe it's actually for better, because to compete with the Russian propaganda in the situation when all the communication channels are completely blocked, is an uphill battle. And I cannot imagine Ernst Thälmann or like whoever you name it from Germans who would distribute their books in 1943. It's extremely unlikely. They were spending their time in a more efficient way, in fighting, in resisting, in actually doing something. And as soon as our effort would pay fruit, after that, the minds of Russians would be open, and then they would accept the information which is in such books. But right now, we are in a situation when we need to do our homework, then when we need to do legwork, when we need to prepare things, when we need to actually fight and defeat the aggressor.
So historically, though, how did Russia get to this point? Why is it so out of step with the rest of Europe? What's the background to that? And ultimately, going ahead, how is it we can make sure it does not return to what it is today? A country that is spilling the seeds of problems around the world, creating revolutions, sending mercenaries. It doesn't look good, and it's affecting the entire world. But how is that prevented? How is that stopped? And where did it come from, though?
First of all, obviously, there was a certain prerequisite, because Russia was an empire for a very long time, and Russians are used to live in empire and used to live in unfree, undemocratic state. They wanted to change it, and it was absolutely obvious that at the end of 80s, beginning of 90s, it was loudly and clearly expressed by Russians. The thing is that their desire, to my mind, was betrayed in 1993 by greed. And not just by greed of Russian elites, but also by greed of many foreigners who preferred privatization over freedom, who were ready to sacrifice their principles of free and fair elections and proper vote count and proper institutions for the ability to make money from privatizing Russian heavy industries. And they made a lot of money. But the result is what we have right now, all those wars. Putin, again, returning to the question, is just a label, is just a brand. When Boris Yeltsin, fully supported by the United States and Bill Clinton, the at that time president of the United States, was shooting legitimately elected Russian parliament with tanks in 1993. One wise man, who was the co-author of the new constitution, by the way, said that when Yeltsin eliminated certain checks and balances within that constitution, he said exactly like, okay, maybe Yeltsin has some idealistic motivation for the market economy and whatever. But what if next guy would be some KGB colonel who would actually privatize the power for himself? And that's exactly what happened. This prophecy worked. But it was predicted at that time. That means that it was logical that this outcome has actually happened. And that's why I think that the actual killing of Russia's chances to become a normal, civilized, democratic, free market state were killed exactly in 1993, and it was solidified in 1996 when, again, with the full support of all the Western democracies, Boris Yeltsin was supported, major fraud during elections, but it was our son of a bitch. So we wanted him to be installed, where we were hearing from many Western nations, and that's the results that we are facing right now.
But what is the objective? If Russia realizes that realistically it's not going to have global domination, let's say, even in Ukraine, in the past year, Russia's gained very little territory, costing tens of thousands of lives per kilometer. More than that, we look at what's happening in Kursk, Russia, where the Ukrainian troops continue to incredibly occupy part of Russia's territory. Now, if Putin and his army cannot force out the Ukrainians located inside of Russia, how would they hope to have a new empire with territory spanning the world? Or is it really just to make sure that the West doesn't have the ability to further expand itself or to guarantee its own security and the global system that it's created? Hence why they support things such as sabotage and arson and other sorts of attacks that we see regularly in Europe. What's your read on it?
I think that only very short-sighted people, and I know that you are not one of them, are thinking that Putin's goals in Ukraine are some territorial gains. He is not fighting for another 100 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. He is fighting, firstly, for Ukraine as a whole. He wants Ukraine to become his puppet state. And secondly, he is fighting for dominance, at least in Europe, at maximum in the world, and building his own axis of evil together with China and North Korea and Iran and Syria and several, Venezuela, by the way, which is quite close to the United States, and some other countries. We think that Vladimir Putin is just unable to stop already, because he completely converted Russian economy onto military rails. He mobilized a lot of people, and again, he is in the same trap as Hitler was in 1939. He could never deliver on promise that Czechoslovakia would be his last conquest, because he already done too much and went too far to make sure that he needs to fight, that he needs to expand his area of dominance, that he needs to wage new wars. And that's exactly what Putin needs to do just to stay in power and to survive. And he also understands that if he loses power, he loses his life. So I think that right now, his bet is extremely simple, that the West would pressure Ukraine to get into some sort of ceasefire, which would be very unpopular with Ukrainians. Then Vladimir Zelensky would lose his power inside Ukraine, and maybe next leader would be somebody like General Zaluzhny, which by who many is believed to be a pretty hardliner, but he is not an experienced statesman who can actually restore Ukraine, its economy, its well-being, its infrastructure, and whatever. And then the new authority in Ukraine would be already somebody who is loyal to Vladimir Putin, who would give people promises for to restore a decent life. And he would pay attention, meanwhile, to rearm himself, and whom will be facing challenge from Russia next, Poland, Baltic states, maybe Kazakhstan. I think most likely that it will be Baltic states and Poland, but it really doesn't matter. What matters is that the war would expand.
So I'd be curious. A lot of people do believe that. And I'm actually sort of an outlier. I'm not sure it would. And there's a reason for it. I think it's because, in fact, in the eyes of the Kremlin, today they are waging not a war in Ukraine. Ukraine is simply a very important battle, but just a battle in a global war. Because what is occurring now is that they're already at war with the West. They sincerely believe that. And I would argue it's even more. It's even probably World War IV in the eyes of Putin. We see what he views as the Soviet Union being tricked and Russia being tricked after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the Cold War specifically was perhaps World War III in his eyes. And what happened in the Cold War, as you well enough know, is that the Soviet Union was very good around the world at using covert action, using assassinations, using revolutions and coups in order to exert influence. And they were successful at it. And the best part is that it's not something that's going to get Article 5 of NATO to come and attack you. Moscow will be fine, but you could still have incredible influence and much less risk. And that's why I would argue, even in the case of Ukraine, I don't think that Putin intended to have a 3-year-long war, as I'm sure you would agree. He thought this would truly be a special military operation, using the Russian military, using all they had done to set the groundwork for this, would roll into town within a week or two, establish a dictatorship or regime that would be loyal to Moscow, and they would control it. And they'd shock the world. And everybody would say, wow, that's incredible. Look at the power of the Kremlin and the influence it has. So globally, though, isn't it easier for them to continue doing things? Look at the Georgian elections. Huge protests broke out after the pro-Russian candidate won. In the case of Moldova, we've read all the stories like we did in Romania about the use of social media by the Russian security services and others to try to influence the population. We've seen the case of Mali, in the case of Niger, in the case of Burkina Faso, the governments there that were overthrown that had people very close to Russia or had recently been in Moscow that went back home and overthrew the governments there. So globally, it seems that Putin is on the march. The Russian government is actively fighting against the West. But incredibly, the West doesn't always believe that. They think it's just a regional issue. Or once Putin finishes with Ukraine, or we cut a deal about Ukraine, then Putin won't be so aggressive anymore. Things will get better. What do you think?
I think that this kind of discussions that just give him a little bit and he would come down, that's again something that we heard during 1930s and didn't work that time. And we know this quote by Winston Churchill, who wants to accept the shame to avoid the fight, would receive both the fight and the shame. And that's what is happening right now, unfortunately. And I think that's very much because of misunderstanding of exactly the thing that you expressed so clearly, that many people believe that what's going on in Ukraine, it's a regional war. It is not. And Russia, being de facto, yes, a regional power and not a global superpower, actually is fighting, firstly, to restore its global position as a global superpower. Secondly, to fundamentally change the way world is being set up right now. There is a philosophical debate about people who say that the world should be based on certain rules, pre-agreed, discussed, United Nations, whatever, but nevertheless the rules. Or the world is governed by interests and by the power of force. Putin believes in the latter, while I believe in the former. And Putin wants to disrupt this approach. He consciously is saying about this loud and clear many times. That's what he was saying from the High Tribune of United Nations. That's what Lavrov is repeating. And that's what very much benefits not just Putin, but countries like China. China is also interested in playing not by the rules, but by the interests. And that's why Putin is so dangerous, because by proving his point that the world is actually run by interests, he opens Pandora box by countries like China to attack Taiwan, by Iran to do things in the Middle East, even by these Hussites, who are fighting in the Red Sea. It's all interest.
So that's very interesting. Now, speaking of interest, I think a lot of what the West understands about Russia, it understands incorrectly. It doesn't understand that, in fact, just because they look like us, they don't necessarily think like us. There is a difference. And you are trying to sort that out. You are trying to help with that. And recently you've opened a project in Washington, D.C. to highlight what it is that you've been doing. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you very much for this. Indeed, we are very excited because on November 5th, we actually gave a start to a project called Free Peoples of Russia House, which is like Free Russia Embassy, which is located literally one block away from US Congress. So it's in the direct side of the Capitol. And in fact, it's the closest international representation office to the cradle of global democracy, to US Capitol, to US Parliament. And our idea is extremely simple, is to educate people. Primarily, our prime audience, target audience, are US Congress staffers, because they are who educating them, their congressmen and their senators. They need, this youth needs to be educated about what's going on in our part of the world and elsewhere. And what youth wants, they like to mingle, they like to party, they like to meet each other. And what we are creating is we're creating this meeting place. It's actually very ironic, because it's very much a common thing in Washington, D.C. for different lobbyists, advocacy groups to have their offices around the Capitol, so that in the evening after the work, staffers can go and have some drinks and have a party and have a discussion and have an interesting event and whatever. The only area where people don't have this is foreign affairs, because for foreign affairs, such things are embassies, which are throwing out receptions and parties and whatever, but all embassies are far away. And these youngsters, sometimes they just physically cannot travel there. And by providing them the space right here, we're actually changing the rules of the game. That's why we hope that our house would turn out to be the disruptor for the whole industry of foreign affairs establishment in Washington, D.C. And we want to promote not just Russians, but we want to promote all the different nations which exist on the territory of Russia, which have different desires, because some of them want to become independent states, some of them want broader economy, autonomy inside Russia, some of them want to develop their culture. So we want to show all this diversity and give everybody the voice, empower every nation and every interest, every region of Russia to be able to speak up.
So that's good. Now, when you talk to Westerners, let me ask you, what do you think they get wrong most often about Russia? You just observed something I think is very important. I think in the eyes of many people, Russia is homogeneous, very large, but homogeneous, which it's not. In fact, it's incredibly diverse. And I think that they also don't understand the fact that there's internal dynamics at work. And though it is a dictatorship, there are local interests, and not everybody gets along so well. Where do you see that?
Sometimes I think it's easier to say what Westerners are seeing right about Russia than what are they seeing wrong, because we may not have enough time in our show to discuss all those myths and prejudices and whatever. But I think that probably the main one is that what is our image of Russia? It's some huge, slow, powerful bear with ushanka and drinking vodka, and some nice girls around. And half-naked Putin who is sitting on top of this bear, and managing it. All of this is wrong. Even though that the most beautiful women are in Ukraine, as we now know. But in terms of this bear, that's the wrong image. because Russia is not as powerful as the bear. It's rather a colossus on the clay legs. Russia is very fragile. It's very easy to broke. There are no people inside Russia which are ready to defend the regime. And in reality, the best picture of Russia was written some, what it was already 80 years ago, actually during World War II, by Antonio Gramsci, a famous Italian thinker, in his prison notes, where he wrote that Russia is a country of a cavalry attack, where a small group of people can actually capture all the commanding posts with one strike. And that's it, because Russia is a country which lacks institutions. And Putin take the situation to absurd, because right now there is no even an institution of presidency in Russia. There is an institution of Vladimir Putin. And that's why the current speaker of Russian parliament sometimes says that if there is no Putin, there is no Russian Federation. He is absolutely right. If no Putin, there is no Russian Federation, because Russian Federation as a statehood right now is Vladimir Putin. That's why it's very easy to change. We just need to have courage to do the change. And we need to understand that the change is inevitable. It will happen one day, because Putin is a mortal person. So one day, even for peaceful, natural reasons, he would die. And then the change would come. And then we need to decide for ourselves whether we want this change to be undictable, chaotic, and whether we want some bad guys like Patrushev or whoever, who are in multitudes there in Russia, take over and make Russia even more dangerous for everyone, or we want to make our alternative and make sure that this alternative has its chances during the transition period. I obviously is voting for latter.
I'm sure. Listen, Ilya, it was great talking to you today. I really appreciate this time to catch up.
It's always my pleasure, and I hope to continue this discussion. You are always up to the point, and you know the situation in Russia the best.
Thank you so much, Ilya. Great seeing you. Have a great day.